Now you've heard quite a lot that's fairly negative about the EU proposals this morning for regulating offshore safety, but actually I want to give out a positive message. And I actually want to thank Mr. Oettinger for what he's actually done. And now that may surprise you that I want to thank him, but and I'm going to explain why we should thank him. Yes, his proposals are misguided. Yes, they're based on false premises, and there is a weak justification supported by a very selective impact assessment, fundamentally flawed impact assessment, which assumes to pile worst case on top of worst case in order to justify their cost-benefit analysis for the regulations. And it's also clear from statements that Mr. Oettinger made, and Malcolm referred to that statement that he made on the 1st of February this year about Europeanisation of energy powers, that there is a different and other agenda working here for centralising that energy policy and strategy in Brussels. And to some extent, this safety regulation is perhaps a bit of a smokescreen for that. But I think the big positive that comes out of all this is that we're all very united in a common cause, in opposition to these proposals. The government, the regulators, the trade unions and industry, all arguably strange bedfellows. But we're actually more united under this safety banner than probably we have been for many years, and probably since Piper Alpha. I see this very much as we happy few, we band of brothers gathered together before the European Union fortress. And I think I can actually see John Taylor down there in the front line. Brother Taylor. Comrade Taylor. But I also want to thank Mr. Oettinger for acknowledging that the UK and the other countries around the North Sea actually have some world-leading regimes, although he does suggest there is room for improvement. And I accept there is always opportunities for improvement, but I would actually challenge the need for a regulation to do that. We're told we have a very successful regime, and we all feel very comfortable with that. We feel proud of what we've achieved over the years. We give ourselves a pat on the back. We accept the praise that we get from anywhere, and you know, feeling good about being best in class, and that dangerous activities are under control. And after 20 years of this current regime, we've all become very comfortable with that. And I'm sure that some of you may actually believe that safety is being done to the max round here. But that sort of feeling can lead us into the temptation to become complacent. And I do see elements of complacency here and there when I have discussions with the industry. And I'm probably just as guilty as any others around here in that respect. We all work extremely hard to make sure that nothing dangerous happens. And when nothing dangerous happens, we see that as a success. But over time, the investment that takes in preventing bad things from happening can become a really hard sell in this industry and to our boards. And so complacency can begin to creep into what we do, that cancerous and inexorable march of complacency. As an example, I would actually cite the step change leadership team. You know, at one stage, that was largely made up of heavyweight Premiership players. But as time has gone on, increasingly the leadership team lacks some of those heavyweight players around that table. Is that because some of the leaders actually feel that we've cracked it, we've got safety well under control? I don't think so. So the good thing that Mr. Oettinger has done is to shake my tree and make me actually question my own belief why we have a world-class system here. What is it that actually makes it successful? What are the opportunities for improvement? For me, the answer is that there are three elements in our successful regime. We have a regulatory regime that provides that constant challenge to us. It drives continuous improvement because we have a goal-setting regime. We have a LARP in there, and we're constantly driving towards that. The second key element for me is stakeholder buy-in. and I mean all the stakeholders. Stakeholder buy-in to the regime as it stands. But how did that happen? It happened because there was, in the early 90s, when the new regime was being put together, there was a highly consultative approach to the development of the regulatory regime. The workers, the employers, the regulators were all involved. And in parallel with the development of the regulatory regime, the interpretative guidance was also developed. So it left nobody in any doubt as to what the regulatory framework meant. And the third element for me is having a well-resourced and competent regulator in both DEC and in HSE. Now, I liken this regime to this three-legged stool. Something constructed of mutually interdependent parts that makes a functioning whole. If you take one of the legs away, it's going to fall over. And then when I do analyse the current position, I do see some weaknesses. I see some shakiness in some of the legs, perhaps getting a bit wobbly here and there. And that could undermine some of the fundamental strengths that we have. As an industry, we respond incredibly well to major incidents such as Macondo. We set up OSPRAG. We work the issues very thoroughly in conjunction with the regulators, the trade unions, the workforce representatives. ALARP provides the regulatory driver to us, and we make progress through a very visible and continuous improvement process. And during that process, we've identified and produced several well-related good practice guides on the back of that. But why did we actually need Macondo before we could have produced those guides? Because much of that information was already contained out there in the industry. It's not new information, but it hadn't been shared until we had a Macondo and came together and shared it. Of course, we don't just respond to major incidents. This sort of thing happens within companies all the time when you have an incident. And ALARP is that constant challenge for us all, and those lesser incidents do enable us to make improvements, but often that's restricted to doing it within the company. But we're still not as good as we could be in terms of sharing and learning information. Let's take another example. One of the big industry drivers over the last year and a half has been this drive to reduce the number of hydrocarbon releases by 50% over a 3-year period. Last year, there were 127 notifiable hydrocarbon releases. But until very recently, there were no examples, no factual information about any of those incidents on the step change safety database, the SAIDI step change website. So why is that? Why can't we be better at actually putting some learning points from those incidents on the step change website, getting better at sharing and learning from incidents? And we could all actually more effectively achieve ALARP that way. So what gets in the way? Looking at the second leg, of course, if we're going to achieve our objective of a directive, we still need to work at the wording in that draft legal framework that the European Union has put together. We have to have something that is understandable, something that is consistent. Without that, then preparation and acceptance of revised major hazard reports will be increasingly difficult, will be a huge challenge for both ourselves and the regulator. And as I mentioned earlier on, UK practice has always been to develop associated interpretive guidance in parallel with the development of the regulations during that consultative process to make sure that misunderstandings are ironed out at an early stage. So when UK regulations have historically come into force, there's already a high degree of mutual understanding and buy-in from all the stakeholders. Now, there's nothing being produced in the European Union, nothing to support those regulations. And I really do wonder, once those regulations come in, if they come in as regulations, where the incentive will be to produce interpretive guidance for regulations that already exist. DG Energy is a tiny organisation, and it will have other priorities. They will simply not have time or inclination to do that. I know Steve has already mentioned the European Union Offshore Authorities Forum. This is a cross-EU regulators forum chaired by somebody from the Commission, Jan Panek, and to which industry and stakeholders can be invited to attend. But is that group going to be given the responsibility to develop this guidance? And so, for me, if these regulations come in as they are, there will be no stakeholder buy-in in the way that we're used to it within the UK regime. And it'll take time to develop that. And in the meantime, we have uncertain requirements, diverting resources away from frontline safety activities, and adding little or no value. And finally, the third leg of the stool in this world-class safety regime is having a competent and well-resourced regulator, and from whom we shamelessly steal their brightest and best given the opportunity and cry foul when we get poor service or advice from them. And make no mistake about it, the proposed European Union regulations will divert much available inspector resource away from frontline safety and into desk-bound major hazard report review and assessment. And that will divert some of your resource as well, and none of which is going to add value. How concerned should we really be to say that there is a dwindling number of key discipline areas of inspectors within HSE, for wells inspectors, for example, being a case in point? So, thanks, Mr. Oettinger, for challenging my beliefs and shaking my potential for complacency, and thanks for making me do a critical review of why I believe the UK regime is best in class, and thanks for forcing me to identify potential weaknesses in the application of our regime, because I believe that with modest industry effort and commitments, we can fix the legs on the wobbly stool without the need to change the law. However, if Mr. Oettinger, you persist with your ill-conceived regulation, you will set us back years. Because let us not forget that regulations on their own will never make things better. That requires hard and continuing work from all the stakeholders, from the industry, the workforce, the regulators, to actually make things happen, to make improvements. So thank you for having joined us up, Mr. Oettinger, and forcing us to challenge our potential for complacency. It's about time the Commission started to listen. And I know Steve Walker earlier on urged us to be subtle with the Commission, but it's very difficult to be subtle when they persistently don't listen to what you're trying to tell them. Now, many of you will be aware that the wording in the regulatory package is already being modified, and the text looks increasingly UK-like in its content. There's much that either is or seems very familiar to us, but therein actually lies the danger. We could actually be lulled into some false sense of security and give out the impression that if the words keep improving, then we'll eventually get to a position where a regulation is okay. There is nothing further from the truth. For all the reasons that Malcolm and others have explained earlier today, there are fundamental objections, and they still remain, however good the wording gets in there, if it's going to be a regulation. We should not forget that. A regulation will be 5 times the effort to apply over and above a directive. A directive will require work. Don't think a directive would not require it, but a regulation would require considerably more effort. It would shift that shift to the European Centre the legal competency. Effectively, you would be bypassing the UK Parliament with health and safety legislation. And just looking for a moment at these reserve powers, if this regulation, or hopefully a directive, really is truly goal-setting, what is the need for reserving powers for? What are they going to do with these reserve powers? And I think we need to press them for examples of why they might want to do that. And despite some of the honeyed words that you've seen in the note that came round today, you should always remember that the proposal is essentially part of a different agenda in which the Commission is looking for Europeanisation of energy powers. The Extractive Industries Directive was mentioned earlier on, and this is under review at the present time, but it is very unclear how that is going to interface with the requirements of this current proposal, albeit that it does say at the front of the European Union proposals that the regulation is without prejudice to the requirement of the Extractive Industries Directive. i.e. if you comply with the Extractive Industries Directive, that will trump the need to comply with the European Union requirements. But it's not entirely clear how that interface is going to work. So just turning to some of the key issues in the regulations, I'm going to go through these fairly quickly. Actually, a LARP has been a key driver in our regulations. The new regulations talk about tolerable. They use a very similar sort of language. They talk about reducing risks until the cost of further risk reduction would be grossly disproportionate to the risk. So that is something that's moved much more closely to what we have and we're familiar with in the UK. But there are other areas, like the terms accept, consent, authorised, which appear to be used somewhat interchangeably throughout the regulation. So it's not quite clear what is meant. Quite a number of the definitions remain unclear and will lead to uncertainty. Third-party verification was mentioned earlier on. It's good to see that in the latest draft they've dropped the reference to third. But it does remain unclear as to whether verification extends to safety management systems or not at the present time, i.e. beyond the current application of the verification system to safety critical elements. The reference to the module code and having modules comply with the 2009 code has also gone, and that was very welcome. But in terms of the major hazard report, or report of major hazard as it has now become, it certainly seems that a rewrite of your safety case is going to be required, and that has to be reaccepted. But do note that you can't get a well consent unless your major hazard report has been accepted. So that's effectively a pretty strong embargo on well activities. Transboundary effects, and here I'm straying a bit into the environmental area. So if a member state considers a major accident on an installation could have significant impact on the environment of another member state, then relevant information has to be sent to the affected member state and agree measures. So a big spill in the UKCS could go to Norway or Holland or Denmark. So it's very unclear as to how that might work in practice. So in summing up, we have to keep our pressure on the European Commission. We do strongly believe in continuous improvement, but this isn't done by making changes to regulations. We must remain united in our efforts and move the European Union away from regulation and to a directive. It won't be without its problems, but getting the wording right is key, because a directive would blend much more effectively with the requirements we already have in place. Thank you.